And welcome to Office Hours this afternoon. And I'm so grateful for every one of you that's come, our regular guests, as well as some new faces that have joined us as well. The whole purpose of Office Hours is to take time each week to engage the various questions that we receive with different members of the Strong Towns team, whether the staff members or Andrew Burleson, our board chair, is going to be doing a session in a little while on mobilizing movement. We're also interested in opening this up even to other experts or guests with particular expertise in different areas. And so that's all coming up. I want to just have a quick programming note as well that registration for the next batch of sessions is now available, and that's putting 5 onto your calendar. That way you have the same Zoom link for the next 5, which actually just works out that it's every Wednesday in March, beginning with Chuck Moreau next week. But this afternoon, our guest and a friend is Rachel Quednau. Rachel is the program director at Strong Towns, and she is the glue that holds the organization together. She is a marshal of resources and knows how to build an organization in so many different ways. And in addition to that, Rachel has also recently, maybe I'll let Rachel share the story of her little one, but she is here to talk this afternoon and to field questions in the chat, as well as pre-submitted questions related to parenting and Strong Towns. And so please feel free to jump into the chat, and there's always lots of good discussion going on there. That won't be a distraction. That's just part of the process. If you do get distracted by the chat, you can always just exit out of it. But what I would encourage you to do is, if you have articles or other resources that you want to share, I will collect all of those and also post them with the links to the recording as well. So that's a great way to kind of compile a whole bunch of different resources. Who knows, perhaps some PhD student one day will take this as primary resources on how parents in these days felt before the world became a Strong Towns haven.
I feel a little bit inadequate to speak on this topic because I've only been a parent for about 4 months now, but I have been thinking about Strong Towns issues for a long, long time as an employee here and a volunteer at Strong Towns even before that. So I was thinking about this stuff even before I formally became a parent. So I really believe that Strong Towns are going to be family-friendly towns. And the more that we can work towards the goals of building Strong Towns, the more it's going to benefit everybody, especially people with kids. So first, obligatory baby photo. This is my son. And on the left is a picture from when he was just a tiny newborn, doing one of my favorite things to do with him, which is just go for a walk in our neighborhood. And it seems like such a core pillar of being a parent is being outside with your kid. And so I'm hopeful that any way that we can work to build Strong Towns is going to enable us to get outside with our kids more often. So I just started thinking about a few of the things that come top of mind at the intersection of building Strong Towns and being a parent. And the first one for me is just having safer streets where kids can walk or be in a stroller and eventually bike safely to get wherever. Maybe just going for a little walk, or maybe it's going to the park or school, church, and hopefully being able to do that independently once they're old enough to do so. I would love to be able to just send my son to the park when he's older. I don't know if I'm going to feel comfortable with that, knowing the streets that he's going to have to cross to do that, but that's something I think about. Another reason that Strong Towns advocates should be, thinking about also their issues of being parent is building public spaces where kids are welcome. Parks, lakes, other bodies of water, plazas. The more of these public spaces that we have, I think the better it is for little kids to run around and make noise and all that. And then when we build Strong Towns, we have things nearby so that we don't have to do what is, for all of us, most of us, the most dangerous thing that we do every day, which is get in a car. The more that there's grocery stores and schools and, your friends nearby, the less we have to put our kids in a car and do that activity, which the less, the better, in my opinion. A couple other things that I'm thinking about as a parent more than ever are having greater housing options in my neighborhood. I feel fortunate to live in an old neighborhood that has, gridded streets and a lot of different housing types, duplexes. We've got small apartments and plenty of single family homes. So a lot of different options for people at different price points. We all know how expensive it is to raise kids. So having housing options that are affordable, that can fit a family, but also housing options where relatives can live nearby. My in-laws are about a 10-minute drive away from our house, and they're in their 60s. They're thinking about aging, and they really wanted to age in place. So they live in a condo. They don't have to worry about a yard and all that stuff. They hope to be in that condo for many, many years to come. And it's great that they can be super close to us and be a part of our son's life, and have a housing option that works for them. Another issue that we have written about many times at Strong Towns over the years is having neighborhood schools. In many communities, we've knocked down the old neighborhood schools in favor of, one big central school campus. And that, deprives us of the ability to have schools nearby, have schools be more embedded in the community. I haven't had to think about schools yet, but I do know that there are, thankfully, several public schools that look to be within walking distance of my house. So I'm hoping that those will work out for my son. But I know that that's not something that everybody has the option of. Also daycares. I haven't been so lucky in that area. We tried to get into the close daycare that would have been like a mile walk away from our house. Couldn't get in. So we're at a little bit farther away daycare, but having childcare options in your neighborhood is really important and valuable. And then finally, this more intangible thing of having a close-knit community where neighbors watch out for each other and support each other. You can't manufacture that, but I do think that the built environment of our communities does contribute. I know that the houses in my neighborhood are close enough by. People don't have huge fences or anything. And so if I'm carrying the car seat and a bag of groceries and my neighbor sees me, they can come over and offer to help. Or I think about the fact that we have some neighbors across the street that we don't really know very well, but we saw earlier last year that they had a new baby. And then, several months later, they saw us, out on our porch with our new baby, and they came over and brought a bunch of baby clothes over that their child had grown out of. So just those little things that help, bring communities together. I think those are especially beneficial when you're a parent. Those are some initial thoughts, things that I'm thinking about now that I'm a parent and a Strong Towns advocate.
Michael Natelli, another Strong Towns member, wrote a piece about vulnerable friendly cities, and the idea that when we care for the vulnerable and are able to consciously think of their needs, that it actually has spillover benefits to everybody around us. Now that you're a parent, what has this helped you to see, and how has your perspective changed?
I was actually thinking about exactly what you mentioned a second ago, which is the fact that when we're building, streets that are safer for kids and places that are easy to push a stroller, we're also building places that are easier to wheel a wheelchair, or, streets that feel safe to cross if you are elderly and it takes you longer to get across the street. So there's everything that we advocate for at Strong Towns. If it's going to benefit, little kids, elderly people, whoever, it's also going to benefit all of us. We will all benefit from having safer streets that are safer to cross, neighborhood parks. Who is not going to enjoy a neighborhood park, even if there's, a playground for the kids? It's a benefit to everyone. So that's a huge thing that I think about now. There are certain things that are more important to me as a parent, but they're also a value to everybody.
Mm-hmm. Have you felt the wrath of having to turn a stroller around when you realized that there was no way to navigate any further with the stroller? If not, it won't come.
Especially with the snow, because I'm in Milwaukee, so we've had a few big snowfalls lately, and trying to grab the car seat over the huge piles of snow is not the easiest. But I've mostly just stuck to our quiet neighborhood streets when going for walks, because I haven't really wanted to risk the huge strody environments. But I'm sure we'll get there, and we'll just do our best. But
how do you look at strong tense issues as a parent in a distinctive light? I mean, what is it about that maternal or and nurturing instinct that really, I think, drives advocacy and drives concern for these types of issues?
I'm still pretty new to this, and I'm sure like my perspective will change as my son gets older, and I'm like thinking about, I mean, he can't even walk yet. So once he can walk and run, then it's going to be a different way of navigating the space. But one thing that I've like looked at in a new light is just how are public and private spaces welcoming or not welcoming to kids. And like, I'm not trying to take him to a fancy restaurant, like that doesn't make sense. But places like, we have several indoor market halls and things in Milwaukee that are really nicely oriented towards there's space for kids to play. And there's also, you're not going to feel really self-conscious if the kid starts crying in the middle of the space. And so having communities where there is flexibility around zoning and development, where places aren't required to provide a million parking spots, but instead they could have like an outdoor eating area, all those sorts of things I'm newly aware of when I'm thinking about like getting outside the house with my son and being in places that are welcoming to kids. So that's one thing I've been thinking about as a new parent that I never thought about before. It's like, how am I going to navigate a stroller into this space? Or what's going to happen if there's a little tantrum in this space? Is everyone going to be staring at me, or is it going to be fine? Yeah.
Well, certainly one of the things that stands out too is just how much more room you need to navigate. Like a sidewalk has to be a sufficient width. A parking lot needs to have, proper ability. Like you have to be able to cross it or be able to like maneuver around it. And when it's all structured around this size of an automobile and there's not much space left for pedestrians, that becomes a real challenge. I thought that you asked a really fascinating question in an interview that you did with two men that were writing about their experiences as parents raising children with Down syndrome. And the question you asked was, how can strong citizens help create places that are welcoming and accessible to parents and children with Down syndrome? But I wanted to ask you that question in terms of what are some of the concrete things that need to change that you felt either were that they talked about or things that you've seen in your understanding of these things as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm drawing on my conversations with parents that have kids with Down syndrome. And one thing that is coming to mind for me is actually not this podcast, although I should go back and listen to this. It's one of the first articles that I ever worked with a Strong Towns member on. His name is George, and he has a daughter with Down syndrome. He lives in Minnesota. And yeah, I remember him talking about how it was really important for him that she be able to have places where she could be independent. And he really wanted her to be able to walk to school by herself, or walk to school with her sister, but walk to school, on her own, not with her parents. And the challenge of number one, like, are the streets safe enough? And number two, is anybody else out walking? Or are people going to be like looking at me like I'm a bad parent for letting my kid walk by themselves? Are there going to be other people around where if the girls had an issue that they could go to, another trusted family that was walking? So yeah, I think just having communities where kids can be independent, whether that's kids with Down syndrome or, any other child, has the ability to like start developing independence and doesn't just have to get in a car to go anywhere. I think that's something that we all are working towards at Strong Towns.
I mean, in pediatrics, from a professional standpoint, everybody's worried about mental health. And for children to be able to get around on their own, to get to their friends, get to their sports, their piano lessons, their clubs, all those things that I could do as a child, and now nobody can do unless there's a parent to drive them. And I saw with my own kids the isolation and the loneliness that they've struggled with, that they did struggle with, because everything always depended on the parent being available. And then once you do start building something, it does need to be safe, that needs to be paths that can be, Rachel already addressed all this, that rolling vehicles, whether it's old people or young people or middle people, any number of reasons why anybody of any age might need to be rolling. And that needs to be able to be safe, and needs to go places that people want to go. This is just all classic Strong Towns material. I tried to write to the Urban Cycling Institute once to see if anybody over there in the Netherlands has done the research to see, do the kids in Holland, in the Netherlands, have a lower rate of mental health issues compared to North American kids? And I didn't get an answer, but that's a study I would be very interested in either seeing or participating in. Anyway, so I'm obsessed with this, actually. And my kids know it, because it's such a disservice to children, and there's so many ways they've been harmed over the last 50 or 60 years. Just seeing parents, their anxiety levels overall are through the roof right now. And so how to help parents feel safe letting their kids go do things and take the risk that they're going to get hurt.
No, I love that. Thank you, Sharon, because I think it's one of the interesting ways in which the idea, I mean, Strong Towns is not the only one to come up with this, but that making many small bets is actually critical to building resilience, because you diversify sort of your risks and things like that. But even when it comes to children playing and children experiencing the world around them, if they're not being exposed to small risks that they can begin to discern and decipher for themselves, they actually are at greater risk of being oblivious to what real significant, life-threatening risk actually resembles and feels like, and lacking that critical awareness.
Right.
Yeah. How do we organize? How do we call people to action? How do we get them fired up and then to stay fired up?
Definitely still in the throes of just figuring out schedules and things with a little one. So, I mean, that's a barrier, is navigating life with small kids, and finding time for much of anything else besides like work and family. Definitely a challenge, but I think, again, like going back to what we talked about earlier, making it clear that the things that we do that will benefit families and children will also benefit everybody. I think that's got to be like a key organizing point. When people make the case about funding for schools and things, sometimes it doesn't click for everyone, because they're like, well, I don't have kids. But I hope that if we're talking about, improving parks or making this intersection easier to cross, that we can all see how we would benefit from those things. So I don't have any amazing organizing experience or advice yet. I don't know, Norm, you're more of an organizer than me. Do you have the thoughts on this question?
I think what you started with is actually really critical to always acknowledge, which is that there's stages that people fall into. And we have found actually in our community that grandparents make better advocates than parents. And it's a consequence of seeing the world almost with fresh eyes, where for one, there's a bit of nostalgia that says, well, my upbringing wasn't like this. I see my kids carting my grandkids around in the car all the time. And, I'd never had to do that for them. And so there's a perception that there's been a cultural shift, but also a landscape shift. And I think sometimes that can be a way by addressing, I think we could probably write more on this even within the Strong Towns context, is by addressing what parents and children in particular face, that we actually engage another audience, a generation up that is very aware of what Sharon's talking about in terms of mental health, very aware of these barricades, but perhaps have a bit of additional time as well as some savvy to try to engage locally. The challenge is that, everybody's too busy to fix the problems that are making us so busy and frantic and harried. And we're kind of backing ourselves into situations where we don't yet have kind of a critical mass in our community to, for example, simply convert core streets that run up to schools, turn them into safe streets to get to school. There's one neighborhood that's finally been allowed to do this. They've been and I think this is instructive, they've been very cohesive and coherent together as a community for quite some time. And they took the one road that runs right up to the school, that basically runs. So if the school is at the end of the street, it goes right like this, and they just closed it to all traffic. even like regular folks that live there, they say, I don't drive that street during the time that kids are going to school and when the kids are coming back from school, sort of the date or the hours of the Great Migration. And what it does is it creates these amazing migration routes for children to first come from their homes, filter into those places, and then pass on their way to school. And I think we actually, if we care about our built environment, the development patterns, all of that sort of stuff, it also it creates an opportunity, I think, for good alliances with school safety advocates, people that are really pressing on the way in which kids get to school, leave school, as well as some of the opportunities that are around them. Barbara says that even elementary students can't walk to school because it's too far. That's totally a consequence of the built environment being constructed that way and not providing opportunity. Andrew, this is a preview of Andrew Burleson's discussion that we'll have in several weeks from now on mobilizing a movement. But I want to throw it over to you, Andrew. Andrew is the proud father of 4 children and living in Denver at the moment, which has, and as he has said, lives in one of the best neighborhoods in terms of walkability and other things like that. So, Andrew, what about for you? What advice do you have for those who want to organize around these issues?
I am personally a little more of an egghead and a little more of the let's work on understanding the ideas and hopefully other people will hear the ideas and change the way they think. Most of your neighbors have never thought about this. Yeah. They're not opposed. It has never occurred to them that the street in front of your house is a disaster. It just hasn't occurred to them. It's just a car sewer. It's just how the world is. How else would it ever be? Most of your neighbors have never visited Europe. They've never visited Asia. They've never visited, unless you live in Boston, they've never been to Boston. They've never been to Old Town Philadelphia. Even if your neighbors are in the middle of Pennsylvania, they probably haven't been to Old Town Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. So the fact that you're interested in this stuff is very unusual. And But these things are not hard to understand. They just haven't thought about it. So to me, I think to the extent that I organize people as a Strong Towns board member, my personal way of organizing is to convince people to join Strong Towns. So what I do a lot is just talk to people about, hey, this street's really dangerous. And it's really frustrating and unsafe for my kids to cross here. The other thing is, I tell a lot of people that we're losing money on stuff and they go, what? Mm-hmm. And then you can have a really good conversation around yeah, did you know that all these projects are hugely in debt and not making any, they don't make any ROI and blah, blah, blah. And that all this development out here is really heavily subsidized. And people are holy cow, I've never thought of any of that. And then what will happen is a lot of them are kind of that's great, but did you catch the score of the Broncos game? Right. That's fine. Let them not care. You don't have to force it. Right. But a lot of people will be interested and engage. And if you can just kind of have a running dialogue with your neighbors, they will start to get interested in stuff. I feel I've learned this the hard way. You can't have that be the only thing you ever talk with your neighbors about, or you're that annoying guy who lives next door and won't shut up about bike lanes or whatever. Right. But, you just build friendships. And I think the single easiest and best thing you could do is have as a personal goal to know your neighbors for 3 or 4 houses in each directions and just be invested in their lives and how they're doing as people. And occasionally mention some of the things that interest you about towns and what's going on in the city. And then what will happen is from time to time, something will come up, a ballot initiative, a neighborhood project or whatever, where you look at it and are whoa, we really need this to go this way instead of that way, right? And at that moment, you're able to say to your neighbors, hey, I don't know if you've heard about this thing, but I think it's really important that this thing goes this way for this reason. And, it would mean a lot to me if that would be something you'd support, or, let me know if you have any questions or if you feel comfortable with that. I'm trying to raise support for this because I think it's really important. And at that point, you've planted the seeds and your neighbors are very likely to kind of join you as advocates for that particular thing that actually affects them. You're probably not going to get them to be very worried about federal transportation budgets or something. And they don't need to. And you maybe don't need to either, honestly. Just your worrying about your own neighborhood is probably enough. So it's already going to be a brutal lifelong fight to just make your own neighborhood a little better. So But yeah, that's how I think about it. It's just like try to build authentic relationship with your neighbors. That's the most important thing you can do to build a strong town. And as part of that, sharing your interests will naturally give the people who you talk to the chance to think about things they've never thought of before. And some of them over time will naturally become co-advocates along with you. And hopefully they'll reciprocate the behavior you modeled. And over time, your whole neighborhood and community will all become a lot more mobilized for these things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, bringing up the money is such a good point too, because like who isn't going to listen when you talk about how their tax dollars are being spent? I mean, highways is such a huge one in my mind. Like, oh yeah, we're going to expand that highway and add some lanes and my commute will be faster. Great. Like that sounds nice to the average person. And then if you actually explain how much money that's going to cost and think about all the other things we might be able to do with that money. Like fix all our neighborhood streets or improve that park or whatever.
Sharon just said she'd like to be able to do the neighborhood for her or the math for her actual neighborhood. Mm-hmm. You don't have to do an urban 3 analysis. I Googled in a few minutes the other day. I'm from Austin and they're proposing this expansion of I-35 and it's like 4 miles of freeway and the cost is estimated to be 8 million. Now we all know that's a lie. It'll probably be more like 15 to 20 million by the time the dust has settled. But let's just go with, I might have said billion with a B. So let's just say 8 billion and let's take it at face value. I then Googled like what was the cost of building the most recent high school in Austin and how many schools are there in Austin School District. And long story short, you could tear down and rebuild every school in the entire city of Austin for the cost of this 4 miles of freeway. And if you tell your neighbor that, they're astounded. They just cannot imagine that we would spend that much money on something. And they're like, wait a minute, I don't understand. Yeah, roads are so expensive. People have no idea. Any number that's larger than like $1,000 like becomes very fuzzy very fast. And if you get over $1 million, like it might as well just be Greek. So I think like equipping yourself to be able to do very quick napkin math on like what one thing costs, like for example, what your town spent the last time they did maintenance on a park or something versus what they're proposing for an intersection. Like a lot of times one traffic light costs more than the park budget to maintain an entire city park. And so people will be like, oh, we should put stoplights all over here or whatever. And it's like, okay, tell your neighbor that like one traffic light costs the same as fixing up an entire city park. And they start to be like, that can't be right. But then they'll check and you're right. And then now they're really listening to what you have to say on these topics. So anyway, that's not the do the math that we often sort of like promote when we're trying to like talk to city planners and city officials. But if you're trying to talk to your neighbors, do the math of like this thing costs the same as that thing is like much simpler and easier. And I think personally like more rhetorically effective.
I want to also ask Seth Zarin. Seth is, as described on the Strongtown site, a recovering city planner turned neighborhood developer, advocate, and educator. And so, Seth, what comments do you have as these thoughts come to your mind?
Well, I also have little kids, which has changed my relationship to both my, planning and my development work. And I'm a neighborhood developer. I do small and mid-sized commercial and residential development projects in the neighborhood that I live and work in. And so that part's great, but and it's nice to be able to sort of share that kind of work with your kids so they can see that the city isn't just built by someone else somewhere over there, that it's an active human process that takes people to do it. But yeah, I struggle a lot with trying to make sure that there will be space for my kids in this neighborhood, because in 20 years, I'm still going to live in my house. And they're hopefully going to want to be in their own house, and which means we got to build some more houses, or they're going to have to like buy your house or leave. And so that's really put a sharper edge on a lot of my own work. It's a little bit of that grandparent problem. I definitely feel the grandparent thing though, because my like capacity for advocacy work is like nosedived. It's getting a little bit better as the kids get a little older, but yeah, at the end of the day, I find it very effective to talk to people about housing in the context of you would like to live near your grandchildren. And how's that going to work? And that starts to get people's wheels spinning in a way where if they're focused just on the fact that they have a house and that's fine, and it's going up in equity value, they're sort of like, what's the problem? There's no problem. So that's something I've found to be helpful.
What are a few things that Strongtown's advocates can do to connect the dots for parents of younger children so they'll be on board with efforts to improve the quality and safety of their neighborhoods?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is painting a picture of a different way of life. Like Andrew was saying, most people have never thought about a lot of the stuff that we all as strong trans advocates think about every day. Like painting a picture for someone that there's a world in which you don't have to drive your kid to school every day and to soccer practice and to music class or whatever. Like there is a world where they take the bus or they bike or, walk with another parent or whatever the case is. I was thinking about a podcast I did several months ago with a family in, I'm going to forget where in Canada they live, but they have started this e-bike company, and they got really passionate about e-bikes because they started just biking with their kids and realized that they would benefit from some electric power because they have 3 little ones, and pushing 3 kids in a cargo bike is a lot. But they were talking about how just traveling by bike is this totally different experience with children. Like when kids are in the car, they can't even see out the window unless they're, a certain age. And when they're in the bike, they're looking around. They even start to understand like the geography of their city, because it's like, oh, this is the route we take, to go to church every Sunday or whatever. And, you could actually talk to your kids while you're on the bike. They had, I think, a cargo bike with like the front section. The kids can talk to each other, and you're outside, it's fresh air, and like, wow, what an amazing difference that is versus packing everyone in the car seat. I mean, I know like my son pretty much screams every time he has to be strapped into the car seat. Not fun. And so like as strong trans advocates, whether you have kids or not, communicating to people that like there is another possibility of how you could live. I think that's a huge thing that we can all do. Just like painting that picture of a different way of life.
And I would say if you're trying to like convince your neighbors, I've learned the hard way that it's like very unproductive to talk about the negative of like, I wish that people wouldn't drive. I wish that I didn't have to drive my kid, because people think you're an alien from Mars. They're like, well, how else would you ever do anything? You're crazy. And they're not listening anymore beyond that point. If you instead focus on, it's so good for my kids when they can walk themselves to the park, like that freedom and independence is so good for them. I just wish it was safe for them to cross the street. Or like, I just wish that the streets in our neighborhood were safe so I could let my kids all play outside like I did when I was a kid. Like that kind of stuff is like extremely rhetorically winning. And it's really hard. Like because if we're like being inside baseball with a bunch of true believers, it's like, yes, cars are the problem. They've ruined everything. If we could just magically disappear all the cars from the world, like all these problems would go away. We would have different problems instead, right? Like, but it can feel like, oh, I just am so sick of this and I want to vent about how much I hate cars. But Chuck likes to point out like 99% of us have a car, use it, appreciate it when we use it. Like the car's not evil. We have allowed our streets to be built in a way that makes car traffic unsafe to be around. That's like the problem. And, but this is just such a like second or third level of thing to understand when people have never thought about this, that I think it's just really, really helpful to remember. If you're trying to persuade somebody, it's so positive and helpful to focus on like the positive benefits that you wish you had, and not make them feel like confused or alienated or attacked for like lifestyle things that are just completely the normal way that everyone around you was all raised, right? So yeah, very hard to do. I make that mistake a lot and kick myself every time. But if you can master talking about just the benefits and the people who gain, instead of like making it about the negative, that's more persuasive.
Very true. And who is not going to be compelled by an argument that this is going to be good for your child? I'm already being exposed to the world of like, oh my gosh, is your child developing properly? Do they meet this milestone? Is this the best possible thing for them? So yeah, compelling arguments for sure.
My brother-in-law and sister-in-law live in Winnipeg, and they have chosen to be live a car light lifestyle. And they say road trips in a car are amazing. because it's a rental car for them and they never have to clean it afterwards. And it's always like top of the line. And so it's kind of an interesting way of just speaking positively to a situation.
I come from the Pleistocene, where we actually were able to walk around small towns, and in the 50s, right? And when I went to college, I discovered that even then, baby boomers had already grown up in places like New York and Chicago, where due to cars, due to crime rates and such, they were no longer letting their children walk around unsupervised. Shoot. I mean, when I was 5 or 6 years old, I used to take family members who were probably 3 and 4 years old, and we'd wander around my grandmother's neighborhood in a small town. I'm sure if I'd let my daughter do that 30 years later, that I would have been arrested for child endangerment, right? So there's not even people out there who, even in the grandparents, who can any longer talk about what it was like for them as a child to have that kind of autonomy. Now, I mean, it's a wonder that we didn't get killed. We actually lived in the country and did things that were just dangerous because we were allowed autonomy, and we all survived. But so there's that. I don't know if we can find people that can tell stories of what it was like as a child, and probably not 6 or 7, but at least by 10 or 12, of being able to do things by themselves around the neighborhood without having to have adult eyes on them.
Yeah, I find that fascinating, especially Jake's comment about, wouldn't it be great if our kids could walk to every school and every park in our town safely? And I think that actually speaks to one of the ways in which we need to see that this is a whole system within neighborhoods that should function together. And what we've allowed them to do is become separated. And I mean, certainly there's cultural factors. There's the rise of stranger danger due to sensationalist media reporting on child abductions that really were, overblown, but sold newspapers and caused people to reevaluate their places. But you also have key things like vehicle sizes have increased. There's a lot of changes that have occurred because of our development patterns in the assumptions that people have about how they use streets. And so when I stopped a kid racing down our street, and he said, well, I was doing 50 kilometers an hour, which is 35 miles per hour for you folks that haven't gotten with the metric system yet. And he was defending what he was doing, even though we were playing there. And he said, but I was doing the speed limit. And my blood was up because he was threatening my children, or my child, I should say, and his buddies. And it was just so frustrating to face that. And so assumptions about what speed is suitable, and also a lack of social shaming of those that are, blasting through a neighborhood. There's effort to do that, but you get, some strange looks when you yell. Although maybe also houses that are defined by garages, not by front porches, that definitely creates a lack of eyes on the street and all of those things. But I had an interesting experience, maybe I could share here, that there was our neighbor just a couple of houses down had a rental car, and it was the morning of a school day, and he went blasting down our street in order to then make a quick turn and get out. He must have been late. And so I yelled, and I was like, hey. And that afternoon, he stopped by. My son and I were playing in our front yard. He stops by and he said, hey, I want to apologize, which is not what I was expecting him to do. And he said, my daughter was in the back seat, and she said, Dad, wouldn't you have yelled like that too? And it was an interesting moment. He realized, like, oh yeah, I done messed up. And that was an interesting kind of experience to see that when we think of our place as a neighborhood, all of a sudden we're going to care about it more. And one of the things I think Strong Towns needs to do is develop neighborhood pace car stickers that everybody can just stick on the back of their car and just proclaim themselves a neighborhood pace car to set what is a safe speed within a community, rather than only relying. We eventually will change the built environment to model and force drivers to drive in a safer way. But I think some of that can happen also through social encouragement as well. And then also, we talked about parks and things like that. There's a great article on the Dear Winnipeg site about how communities used to have scores of parks scattered throughout all the all of their neighborhoods, neighborhood pools, neighborhood splash pads, all of that sort of stuff. And a lot of that has been dropped or abandoned in favor of consolidation. And I think that that may be one of the very strong townsy sort of angles on these questions is by consolidating so many things into power centers, into super rec centers, into large hulking buildings where you can get your pool, your library, and a pedicure, that the consequence of that is it actually removes the ability to do a lot of those things locally. Schools, Chuck talks eloquently about trying to get his community school to be saved. Because they were proposing instead to just ship all the kids further away. Those are all factors here as well, where there is a strong towns component to it. Camille, thank you for your comment in the chat as well. She said, I grew up in the 90s and the thousands and seriously longed for the type of existence that I witnessed in certain stories in media. That totally, I had a different experience growing up on a farm where my perception was that kids in the city had the best life. Turns out they had a very sheltered, cloistered life and didn't, almost didn't leave their property as much as I didn't leave our farm property. But I at least had, 80 acres to explore in contrast. So we're coming up at the top of the hour, but then we do have our after party afterwards for those that are able to stick around. But Rachel, I want to throw it over to you for closing thoughts, anything that stood out that has either triggered an idea for you or some words of exhortation and wisdom to the rest of us.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like for me, I grew up in the city of Minneapolis, but in a mostly residential neighborhood. So I could not walk to a bunch of stuff. But I remember playing in the street, playing in the alley with all the kids in the neighborhood. There was a park nearby. There's a lake nearby that we could walk and bike to. There was a little commercial area that had maybe there's an ice cream store and a couple of other things. So there were a few things, and there was the ability to get around a little bit, at least on your own. It wasn't perfect. We were near quite a busy street that we had to be careful of. But I just think, I don't believe that life is completely lost and there's no hope for that. I hope for that for my son. We're certainly trying to know our neighbors and be embedded in this community. So I hope that isn't lost. I hope that we as Strong Towns advocates can inch our way towards that with our small bets. I don't think we need to just have a dramatic transformation or nothing at all. I hope that we can take those small steps and be glad about small successes. But for some neighborhoods, it's definitely harder than others.
I definitely want to highlight just what Andrew said, which is part of it is engaging neighbors, identifying folks that live in your building or folks that live next door or just a few doors down, and trying to find just those little ways without overstaying or trying the patience of others, but at the same time, just being able to have those observations. Oh, that's, why does this sidewalk suddenly abruptly end? Is there anything that we can do as a community about it? Can we talk to the neighbor about trimming back that bush that's preventing the sidewalk from being passable by strollers or kids in wheelchairs and things like that, rather than immediately calling the bylaws or doing things like that? It's part of it is knowing neighbors, working together with neighbors, trying to encourage one another in those different types of things. Sometimes it's about situations in large apartment buildings. I've heard of residents on the lower floors that will actually say, hey, if you need to store something here, a stroller or things like that, you can do that in our little vestibule. So that way you don't have to hike it up and down the elevator or up and down the stairs. If anyone is interested in, especially in urban side, the city of Vancouver has been doing a lot of things to identify family-friendly housing requirements. The trouble is that these family-friendly housing requirements do drive up costs for family housing, which is one of the trade-offs and certainly one of the difficulties whenever we try to provide regulation. But one of their things is that the encouragement that many of the multi-bedroom units face onto a common courtyard in order to allow that type of mutual watching of children, allowing an individual to just be near the courtyard to watch a handful of kids, so that way parents are able to go about other activities or take on different tasks. And so they did a lot of really, really exciting stuff in understanding how to help, but have a lot of sort of toothless rules and responsibilities for the actual types of housing that have emerged from it. So there's a lot of good stuff on it. I think that we can definitely begin to talk beyond the building, and that would be probably, in my mind, the biggest takeaway from this is that making places family friendly is far more than just the building. And the city of Vancouver would acknowledge that, but it is about the broader ecosystem. And then asking the question, what do we value? What do we want to see in the places that we live and dwell in? So thank you to everybody for attending today. I know a bunch of you will have to step away at the top of the hour, but this has been great. Definitely, like I said, it gets my fire up to talk about these things, but also it's encouraging to know that there are lots of different examples of things that can be done. Next week is Chuck Marone talking about strong towns in small communities and smaller towns. I think that there will still be insights if you live in a larger place, but perhaps you know family members or others that you might be able to talk about. Coming up a month later, we will have Chuck back to talk about strong towns in big communities or big cities as well. So look forward to that as well. Other than that, the last thing I should note is there's a new registration link for the next 5 sessions. And so I did send that out by email to everybody that had registered for at least one of these sessions. After this round, I'm always open to reevaluating just the way that we do it. But I found that with the registration process that it has made it a lot smoother and simpler to understand just the general numbers of how many we're going to have. Again, it's so good to see all of our regulars back. And if this is your first office hours, thank you so much for joining us. The schedule is posted on the website as well. And do come back, and we'll see you in a week.